In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Well, hello, Sublation Media viewers and listeners and readers and all you people out there. This is the Sublation Magazine Show. I'm Douglas Lane. I'm the guy in charge of Sublation Media, the author of Bash Revolution and other novels, the former publishing manager of Zero Books, and an all-around lovable oaf on Twitter. You can find me at Doug Lane on Twitter. Everyone loves me there. And you are?
I'm Dr. Ashley Frawley. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology at Swansea University, and I'm also one half of the Sublation Magazine Show and one of the editors of Sublation Magazine, although I have to say Alfie does all the work.
Alfie does do all the work. Certainly right now he's doing all the work for Sublation Magazine. You should read it. Next week, I'm telling you this for the first time, Ashley, and I'll tell everyone out there. We are going to have Jason Miles on the Sublation Magazine Show to talk about his latest piece in Sublation. I'm looking forward to that. And we should tell everyone that on Patreon, if you sign up every Monday, not only do you get to see the second half of the Sublation Magazine Show, but you get a lecture from Ashley on topics related to Marxism, sociology, socialism. What's the topic?
Social problems.
And social problems. And what's the topic this week, Ashley?
Well, I've got a couple that I might be choosing from, but I'm pretty sure I'm probably going to put one up on social problems.
Okay,
how
that's
to
great.
Understand social problems, how to think critically about them. That's my thing. So I'm going to teach you how to think critically about statistics. One of my favorite things to do. So I'm thinking I'm going to put that one up this week.
Right, but this week we decided to opportunistically talk about a much more popular YouTube channel that's out there on the top that is a socialist channel. It is Second Thought. My son Noah, who's 18 years old, I can't believe that he's that old now, pointed this out to me, and he said, I think I'm quoting him, "Why can't you make videos like this?" So I went in, took a look at what Second Thought was doing, thought it would be worth commenting on some of the things that he was saying. He's a very polished YouTuber. Obviously, he's got a good heart. He's a comrade, but we'll be talking about him today for a while. And on the topic broadly of recession and
degrowth.
And degrowth, yes. Well.
Yeah, is that something we should be fighting for or against? Spoiler, against. Against.
Well, do you want to start with that? Because I thought we could just start with a very short clip from Second Thought, and that kind of sums up his general attitude. And so should we go ahead and do that? Here we go.
And then we'll take things a step further and talk about preventing recessions. Because the truth is, we could stop recessions almost entirely if we wanted to.
So that would be where I feel like Second Thought goes off the rails right at the beginning of his video. There is an assumption that without overturning and changing the foundation of society, without a revolutionary change, that it would be possible simply to, within the world and society as it is, implement a few policies that would and empower the state, the current state, so that we could avoid recessions. I think that is the foundational.
To be fair, is that what he's arguing?
Yeah. To be fair,
it?
Yes, it is.
I thought that he was saying that we could do it. We could have go without recessions if we overcame capitalism, which I would agree with. But we can't overcome recessions within the logic of capitalism. I think that's very basic, and anyone who calls themselves a socialist, I would imagine, is aware of that recessions and depressions and so on. And by the way, you can watch a lecture on this on our Patreon as well. But I thought that the fact that these things are endemic to capitalism is just basic to socialism. So I think I must have just heard what I wanted to hear, but I thought he said if we overcame capitalism, then we could do away with recessions, but he doesn't.
Let's run that again. Let me just double check.
And then we'll take things a step further and talk about preventing recessions. Because the truth is, we could stop recessions almost entirely if we wanted to.
I don't hear anything about overcoming capitalism there. And, we can get to his solution next if you want, but the approach that he takes is having the state control the economy and create a portion of the economy around essential goods that would not be in the market, would be controlled by the state. So for instance, if we could socialize medicine, make sure all the housing was controlled by the state and owned by the state, provide healthcare, I said that already, and childcare through the state, even make sure that everyone was fed through state mandates and control, then we could overcome recessions by controlling distribution and consumption.
Right. I assumed that meant after as a project of overcoming capitalism, he's advocating state ownership and so on. In that case, if it's just a portion of the economy, then no, you're still going to have recessions. You're still going to have the same kinds of problems. I thought it was like he was talking about like after the revolution kind of thing.
No, he's not talking about. We don't need to transform the mode of production or the social relations around production. We just need to have a certain portion of the economy break out of the market and be run by, I guess, fiat money by the state. So because if you understand what he's saying about what causes recessions, then it falls in line. It's sort of we can hold on to this society and just run it with the aim of putting people over profits, which he also talked about. So yeah, he has a do you want to go into right into the other part of the theory here, which I think is
I think we need to understand where he's coming from with what's the cause of recessions, because he kind of glossed over it slightly, and it sounded to me like an underconsumptionist argument.
Right.
So that there's not enough wages in the economy to buy back all of the things that are being produced, and it kind of fell over into a too much stuff kind of argument, which is a mixture of use value and exchange value. It's not that we produce too many use values. It's impossible. That is useful things. It's impossible in a world in which there are people starving to produce too many use values, but we produce too many things that cannot be sold profitably. Yeah.
Yeah. So you want to run the section on underconsumptionism that's from the video now?
Let's do it. I think it's cute.
Marxists, for example, and here I'm pulling from the economist Richard Wolff in case you're interested, often explain recessions like this. In periods of growth, companies expand. That makes sense. Things are going well, so confidence is high, and companies receive investments, borrow money from banks, hire more people, merge and acquire, produce more stuff, and sell more things. The numbers go up. And this works for a while. But as more and more companies do the same thing, eventually production exceeds effective demand. There's too much stuff being produced because almost everyone is chasing growth by producing for the largest market possible. And when everybody follows this same strategy, they inevitably step on each other's toes. Not everyone can produce this much and reap the rewards. There's just too much stuff in the economy because we aren't producing according to our needs. Each company is producing for its own selfish bottom line. Not only is this obviously terrible for environmental reasons, faced with a lack of effective demand, many companies won't make the profits they expected to and invested their money for. So they'll lay off their workers. Investors will stop investing, and all throughout the economy, the repercussions of this failure to grow begin to bounce from business to business as everyone's inputs dry up. More people are suddenly unemployed, businesses shudder to a halt, profits take a dive, and GDP, the total amount of stuff being bought and sold, goes down. And you get a recession.
So that is his theory of recession, and it's a kind of simplified underconsumptionist theory of
I have to say, I really appreciate the clarity of putting forward an underconsumptionist argument and doing that for the masses, and with a really high spec. I think that's great. Of course, I think that the underconsumptionist argument is not a good one. We tend to fall in line with the falling rate of profit here. So it's not that there's too much stuff because we're not producing for human need. We only produce for demand that can pay, which is he's kind of nodding toward. But that's also not the reason why we have a recession. There's not enough profit. The rate of profit is too low for people to be reinvesting back in the market. So there's no incentive. If there's no incentive to do that, to actually create things, then the incentive is for money to go into places, like debt bubbles and so on, giving young people enormous loans that they have to pay back. Why would you invest in trying to compete with Nike when Nike has spent years and years and years developing their means of production, their machines to such a complex extent that the rate of profit that you can expect after investing in that and meeting that level of development is so small. It's going to take you such a long time to get that money back. It is if you're going to get it back, because there's a risk that you're not going to compete. You're not going to be able to effectively compete and sell your shoes or whatever. And so it's much more profitable to to give loans to young people or to, give people debt. But the problem with that is that has to be paid off with future value, future human labor. But there's no incentive to put money in human labor because humans have been replaced by machines for such a long time. Anyway, so what winds up happening is you get these enormous bubbles that can't be paid back. And then eventually the house of cards falls. And I've given that's just a really horrific breakdown of the falling rate of profit. But it's not about there not being enough demand for all of the things because there's just too many things and it's bad for the environment. It's that it's not profitable to invest because the rate of profit is too low. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I have I grabbed a section of the introduction to Andrew Kleinman's book, The Failure of Capitalist Production, and I thought I'd read a little bit from it because it explains underconsumptionism in the context of an alternative theory. It juxtaposes underconsumptionism with what I'll call what do they call it here? Kind of the too little surplus value school, rather than the too much surplus value school. So the underinvestment theory rather than the underconsumptionist theory. The underconsumptionists see the cause of the periodic economic crisis under capitalism as lying in the excessive exploitation of the workers. In Marx's terms, underconsumption attributes crisis and capitalist stagnation to a rate of surplus value that is too high. That is too high not only for the viewpoint of the workers, but even from the standpoint of the interests of capitalists themselves. According to underconsumptionists, the capitalists are appropriating plenty of surplus value, but they cannot find enough buyers for the vast quantity of commodities they are capable of producing with the workers they are excessively exploiting. The result is either acute economic crisis at periodic intervals or long-term economic stagnation with many workers and machines lying idle, or some combination of both. The giant of underconsumption theory in the last century was the celebrated American Marxist economist Paul Sweezy. Sweezy founded and edited the Socialist Magazine Monthly Review, from which the Monthly Review school takes its name. The underconsumptionist school's main rival attributes periodic crises to Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. This school sees the causes of crisis as being the exact opposite of what the Monthly Review and others claim. other underconsumptionists claim it is. The falling rate of profit school holds that it is an insufficient rate of surplus value that leads to acute capitalist economic crisis and long-term stagnation. Too little surplus value is produced, not too little from the viewpoint of workers, of course, but too little relative to the needs of the capitalist system. The best known inspirer of the present day too little surplus value school is a Marxist economist, Heinrich Grossman, who can be seen as the anti-Sweezy. The two men were opponents during their lifetimes, and they remain so after death. Kleinman does not mention Grossman in this book. However, Kleinman definitely belongs to the not enough surplus value school of crisis theory. So the two schools of crisis theory are completely opposed to one another. That is, as stated, they can't both be true. And I am on the side of the too little surplus value school. And the thing to understand about the two approaches is that the underconsumptionist approach, could lead to the idea that degrowth could solve the problem. It could also advocate for trying to impose higher wages onto the capitalist class as a way to, prop up consumption. There are all manner of kind of technical fixes that can be put into place if you hold that the problem is not too little surplus value because of a inherent contradiction within capitalism, but rather too much surplus value that just has to be adequately distributed through some mechanism other than the market. So
there's two additional things that Kleinman says about this. One is, how could profit is the lifeblood of capitalism? Now, okay, I want to say we're straying a little bit away from what Second Thought said, because they argued that, or he argued that it was. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was like many people behind this. He argued that it's too many people chasing a too small market. But part of this school of thought is that it is there's too much, one of the sort of schools of thought that you were talking about around crisis is that there's too much surplus value in the system. And Kleinman says that's just impossible to imagine as causing a crisis, because profit is the lifeblood of capitalism. How could the thing that capitalism runs on, how could it being high lead to a crisis? How could that possibly lead to crisis? And the other thing is that it can lead you to think that workers getting higher wages from capitalists can make capitalism work more effectively. That is not the case. As Marx writes in Wage, Labor, and Capital, the interests of workers and the interests of capitalists are diametrically opposed. When you get higher wages, you do that at the expense of capitalism, but at the for the benefit of humanity. Because capitalists will try their best to knock us back to the Stone Age if they can. They're not going to innovate just for the hell of it because they enjoy it. They innovate in order to reduce the amount of variable capital, that is the amount of time that they have to pay for in terms of workers' lives and energy expended and so on. That is wages. So they're trying to reduce that as low as possible. But if you will work for peanuts, if they can force you to work for very little, they will. And workers pushing back against that is a key part of what dynamism there remains within capitalism. And so we have, the more that workers push, the more they squeeze those profits, the more that capitalists are pushed to innovate to replace the workers. But this doesn't help capitalism itself function better. In fact, it's at the expense of capitalism because it squeezes profits and there's less to reinvest. And so they have to try and reinvest, get rid of those workers, and hopefully make it back in terms of being able to sell. They'll make more products, but they'll sell them more cheaply.
Right. I want to throw something up on the screen that someone said. This is just 101 university level economics and not Marxism. I don't know if I can find that comment right now, but and what what I'd point out is that, and someone else is saying, he's presenting a simplified version of Marxism or even just economics in order to reach a mass audience, which it's true enough. But the thing about it is that he is presenting a simplified version, and he's presenting a simplified version of a particular even Marxist approach to crisis theory, which is I think the monthly review school approach, the underconsumptionist approach, and it's coming to him through Richard Wolff, which is particularly interesting because Richard Wolff, 20 years ago or more, worked with a guy named Resnick to argue that the Soviet Union was state capitalist, and he had to speak to rather complicated value theory in order to make those arguments. Resnick and Wolff did. But when I brought him on to the podcast a year or so ago to talk about what might have changed in his thinking since then, or how that work that he had done before the economic crisis of 2008 had informed his work since 2008, he kind of stonewalled me a bit. He talked about how he came from an Ivy League school, and and not in a way to belittle me exactly, but he did talk about that and how there was no need to complicate the question, and he kind of reduced the distinction between use values and exchange values even was not something he wanted to talk about in public. And so I do think that because of the once you make that move away from some of the difficulties within say Marxist economics, or even within Adam Smith, that distinction between use values and exchange values is in Adam Smith as well. If you are not willing to look at that level of complexity, then what you're going to end up with is whatever fits intuitively within the ruling ideology, I think. And this idea that, we're producing more stuff than people need, and that's leading to an economic crisis because people can't make a profit off of all this junk that nobody needs. That kind of fits with people's moral sensibilities and with their baseline understanding, simplified understanding of economics.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was the intention, but I did worry when that was being said and there was a picture of a stocked supermarket, that was the idea that was coming across, and I was getting a little uncomfortable. And then it sort of segued into degrowth, and I went, oh dear, because it does kind of fit that sort of middle class sensibility of there's just too much stuff, and there are too many SUVs and too many flat screen TVs, and it's sort of looking down your nose at the working class, at their consumption habits. Whereas, I remember years and years ago, I did a debate on obviously my research is on happiness, and one of the idea that happiness is a social problem that governments can solve. And one of the big arguments was money doesn't make you happy, economic growth doesn't make you happy. So I debated this guy who was like a venture capitalist. And he was like, you don't need money to be happy. Here's a picture of my family in the Swiss Alps. We are just enjoying the air. I was like, you're in the fucking Swiss Alps. How'd you get there? That's the idea, right? I just like to go to my second home and unwind, and it's a caricature, obviously, but it's this idea that you should consume, because we can't escape consumption within capitalism. The answer is to impute consumption with meaning. So you should consume for experiences, or you should consume for this or that, and I'm not saying Second Thought is saying this, I'm saying this is the kind of general idea that exists in the culture. It's a romantic anti-capitalism, the romantic critique of capitalism that rejects anything that when it becomes massified and looks constantly for the new. And so these kinds of critiques where you see the stock shelves and there's an implication that there's too much stuff, can really plays on that cultural kind of romantic anti-capitalism. Here's the thing about the ideology of capitalism that makes it so difficult to understand. The ideology of capitalism presents itself as a kind of anti-ideology. It presents itself as anti-capitalism. Mm-hmm. And this can kind of hoodwink you if you're not careful, because who were the first people to argue against consumption and against individualism? It wasn't the socialists. In fact, we've got a very good article coming out in Sublation Magazine about egoism as the heart of communism. It was the conservatives. it was the conservatives that railed against individualism, that argued for community over the individual. And contrary to what someone tried to tell me last week when we talked about fascism, yes, fascists were about putting the community above the individual. It was very important. And that, again, as I say, fascism was heterogeneous and confusing, and they said one thing in one place and one thing in another. It's very difficult to say that there was a coherent ideology, disclaimer, yes. But it is absolutely the case that for many fascists, the community over the individual was an important thing. And they saw the consumption habits of the masses and the so-called democracy of the masses as illusory, ill-led, and the product of psychological stupidity and clever maneuvering on the part of those in power, that it was just duping the masses. These things did not come initially from socialists. They came from the right.
If you don't have very much money, when you are spending it, you are aware of it. And like I went to a kind of a divey bar last night and had a couple of beers, and there weren't that many people there, but there was a group of people who were playing cards and smoking cigarettes and buying beers, and I bet you they knew exactly how many dollars they were spending on everything they were doing, and they were enjoying it. And they would have said to themselves afterwards, I'm sure, as I did, I'm sure glad I had enough money to buy a couple of beers. I liked that, Whereas if you have plenty of money, you can go to the Swiss Alps and fail to recognize how your money helped you get there, I suppose. But
or go to a yoga retreat, or like consume for well-being, or find your true inner self, or whatever it might be. And there's a long history of this sort of thing. The wives of factory owners would often go into the working class areas and proselytize to the workers there that if they wouldn't be so poor, they wouldn't have so much difficulty living on their meager wages if only they didn't spend it on, drink and all of these sorts of things. Like you should, like as a good citizen, as a good worker, you should only live on whatever is serviceable to your master. And somehow that's progressive, because there's been a lot of sort of greenwashing of this stuff. It has come to sound leftist, but it didn't have a leftist origin. Famously, Sylvia Pankhurst, suffragette and socialist, said, "We do not preach a gospel of penury and thrift. We want more. We want more than all the people can consume. We do not want to create a world in which lords become peasants, but where peasants become lords."
Right. We should be fair here to Second Thought. He did not say, no one needs money, and I get my pleasures in life out of just breathing the clean air in the Swiss Alps or anything like that. That is not what Second Thought said. But he did say this. I think this next clip I have is about.
I just want to, just to add to that, I feel that I need to keep giving this disclaimer. What I'm saying is that when I heard these arguments, I was saying you need to be very careful about these sorts of things, because it's feeding into a cultural ethos that actually needs to be contested, not drawn upon.
Okay, so I want to run this next clip then of which I figured out which one it was. I think it's this one about degrowth. You ready? Okay.
In a socialist degrowth economy, basic services are provided on a universal basis, like housing, food, healthcare, childcare, and so on. By taking them out of market mechanisms and the hands of profit-motivated capitalists, we remove the imperative for them to grow. And with that, we get rid of the idea that if growth ever stops, that life necessarily has to become worse to make up for it. In other words, the things that make life good are guaranteed independently of profit. They are provided without being tied to the ability of a few to enrich themselves. And it doesn't have to just be basic services. We can extend this further. For example, with a more planned economy.
So there's a kind of a slippage there between what a lot of people who are socialists or communists would want to embrace, the idea of a planned economy, a democratically controlled economy, perhaps, and this idea that breaking from private capitalism alone and putting the power of capital into the hands of the state, where it can be properly managed, might be a step down the road towards socialism. At least that's how I'm hearing it. And the key here is understanding what capital is and what it's founded upon. And it's founded upon a certain kind of exploitation of labor that doesn't require private property relations to obtain, which is why, and from my perspective, which is why the state capitalist thesis could be posited by people like Richard Wolff and others. What is required is for a certain social relationship, basically one where the amount of time spent working is what gives value to products in the world. Where when that obtains, you have a form of capitalism. When that obtains generally in society, you have a form of capitalism, and the way in which the state comes in and plans production that's still mediated by those social relations isn't going to be particularly relevant if your aim is to overcome the inherent crisis within that form of production. So I just wanted to lay all that dogma that I have in my head out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is that when you slip from degrowth to things that we might do in a planned economy, you risk mischaracterizing what degrowth really means. And I think this is a really common thing for some people who advocate degrowth. Some people do this consciously. They are aware of what it entails. And I think a lot of people otherwise don't. Degrowth would mean a decline in living standards. That's what that would mean. Mm-hmm. I mean, like if you create something new, that is growth, right? So we create new medicines. That is growth. When human beings exert their energy and so on something new that we didn't have before, that is growth. And I assume that the intention is not to freeze or go back to some point in the past. Certainly there are people in the world who definitely don't have enough to consume. The vast majority of humanity doesn't. And so I think part of what people have in mind is that the standard of living maybe in rich Western countries would kind of just stop and it would go into reproduction. But again, that makes no sense because it's not like there's a single standard of living in Western countries. We have enormous class disparity and so on. But then you have poorer countries would need to grow substantially in order to, otherwise degrowth means consigning a huge portion of humanity to poverty forever. And then, I mean, sometimes people go, oh, well, no, I mean, obviously we mean a little bit of, we need growth for a while and blah, blah, blah. But some people will actually then start to say, well, I mean, come on, there are this many people on the planet. They can't all have cars. Like a really good example of this that Lee Phillips gives is how regulation managed to get us to move away from certain ozone depleting chemicals. And the way that people try to deal with problems now is, and replace them with something else, is they'll be like, no, we have to use less of this thing, instead of being like, we have to grow and discover new things in order to move away from these problems that we have. We need to find new resources. We need to, so long as we're in capitalism, obviously invest in green energy and all these sorts of things, nuclear, if we want to be realistic about powering the planet and actually lifting people up out of poverty. So I think people are maybe not thinking this through, what exactly degrowth means. So that's the first issue, that yes, okay, economic growth as a measure is not great. Nobody was ever under the impression that it was. It's a little bit of a straw man to say the governments only care about growth and have pursued growth myopically. No, in fact, they didn't have measures of growth until the Great Depression for good reason. Well, Simon Kuznets developed measures of GNP in order to figure out what the hell was going on, why you suddenly had some kind of horrific contraction that meant enormous numbers of people are out of work. You needed these kinds of measures. So it's not that people were just like single-mindedly pursuing GDP. And it's not that governments were single-mindedly pursuing growth, because actually when you pursue growth, a lot of policies directed at pursuing growth fail. If governments could simply grow like puppet masters and pull the strings of the economy, they would, because recessions are destabilizing. Yes, as Second Thought points out, recessions can be very, very good for some capitalists because it means that they're able to buy up. I mean, that's what happens in a recession. There's enormous devaluation, and you're able to buy up the rusting machinery in the factories and so on. And the cheap labor, you benefit from the cheap labor. So those who survive benefit from the enormous devaluation. All of that happens. But the thing is that growth is to sort of just focus on growth is a fetishization of growth as the be all and the end all of capitalism. Certainly capitalism, especially now, is having an enormous problem with growth. And I think part of the degrowth narrative, I know, and you can read my first book about this, part of the degrowth narrative or the zero growth narrative is a kind of narrative justification for stagnation within capitalism. As capitalism finds it more and more difficult to grow, downplaying its importance is rational, and it's being downplayed now in the West for a while, but it started in the developing world long before. So the era of growth liberalism, in which you had Rostow's stages of growth, this idea that all societies grow inevitably from developing countries through these stages to like rich consumer societies. This started to come into question very early on, and people started to say, well, actually growth might be destabilizing. And growth is destabilizing in the developing world, because what winds up happening is they thought, so the rich countries were like, oh yeah, don't worry, follow us, we're going to make you rich. Don't go to the USSR, poor countries, they're terrible. We're going to make you rich. We're going to give you things, because they thought that poverty was destabilizing, which was right. And they were like, okay, if you follow these stages of growth, there's going to be a convergence of values, and it's going to be this one big democratic happy world. And that wasn't happening. And growth also wasn't happening. So what happens is growth liberalism raised people's expectations, but also dashed them. So you told people you were going to have a better life, and then you didn't give it to them. But some people did get it, right? You had rich people got hospitals in the city centers that were paid for by the work of the poor out in the fields. And so it started to, the idea of growth, the attitude toward growth among those in power started to shift as early as the 1960s, in which they started to downplay it for the developing world. And they started to bring in ideas like, well, money doesn't make you happy. And you saw this sort of gradual shift toward sustainability, toward low expectations. You had this idea in the 1940s that the entire world was going to be developed. The World Health Organization defined health as like the best possible state of being, not just the absence of illness or infirmity. And by the time you got to the 2000s, it was like, or 90s, it was like, our Millennium Development Goals, babies won't die of diarrhea. And that was like an aspiration. We were all like, yeah, we're going to save babies from dying from diarrhea. Like that was it. Improved breastfeeding rates and so on. These were the goals for the developing world, because growth liberalism didn't work. They were not able to just pull the strings and make things grow, because global capitalism also depended on cheap labor and so on in these poor areas. And that when they were just developing infrastructure just to get the cheap raw materials out, they were flooding these new markets with commodities, et cetera, et cetera. So global capitalism itself destroyed the dream of growth liberalism. And now we get this degrowth nightmare that presents itself as socialist, but is actually very much in keeping with the trajectory of capitalism that is on its way out. And what we should be fighting, and we shouldn't go with that narrative, because that's the narrative that actually capitalism has been giving for quite some time, that actually you don't need money to be happy. Well, yeah, okay, tell your boss that. Or let your boss tell you that when you go out on the pit line. No? Right. So all these sorts of ideas, it all comes from within. We don't need economic growth. Economic growth is a bad measure, blah, blah, blah. And it's basically, I think, a smokescreen for a capitalism in decline.
I want you to address this comment. The idea that everyone can just consume more is just wrong. We're going to destroy the earth because of overconsumption. So if you don't understand that we're literally eating the earth we live on, you are not serious in today's world.
Yeah. If you see human beings as a plague on the planet, as just mouths that eat instead of minds that think and hands that work, you are not a socialist. That is a very conservative view. That is a very anti-human view. All human beings are not just eaters. No, we think, we create, we solve problems. And when you give people enough to survive, they think and create. That's what they do. You know, this is when you had time periods where all of a sudden there was abundance for at least a small portion of the population. Say, for example, after a few shifts in 1500s, 1600s, the clergy in England were given a certain amount of the produce, regardless of whether or not it was a bad year. So the peasants suffered horrifically if it was a bad year, but the clergy always got a certain amount. And so if you read like their diaries from that time, they were talking about like enormous meals of like, like there's like one of them sitting there with like pheasants and this and that and so on. They were just horrifically rich. And at the same time, they had a ton of time on their hands, and they produced enormous advances in like entomology and just like random things. Because when you give people free time, you give them freedom from the threat of starvation, they're free to become creative. And that is the purpose of communism and socialism. Now, in terms of like, oh, we're just going to eat the whole planet. What counts as a resource now may not count or did not count as a resource 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. Gave the example, I think, in our Patreon last week of ancient Greece, in which the population of humans on the planet was something like 300 million people. And even then, the ancient Greeks were like, human beings are a plague on the planet. There are just too many of us, and we're eating up the entire world. I can't do a Greek accent. Υποθέτω μπορώ να το πω στα ελληνικά with a terrible accent in modern Greek. Anyways, I don't know. I can't remember the exact details of the exact quote. But anyways, ancient Greeks said the exact same thing. But what counted for them as a resource was far less than what counts for us as a resource. And of course, I think in a future system in which the consumption of human beings and the comfort of human beings is the end goal, and we are able to pursue that in an unmediated way, or at least in a way that it's not mediated by profit, with which we agree with second thought, then you are able to greatly increase the consumption of the masses. And I will tell you that we can do this. We can do this right now. We have the ability to do this right now with the resources that exist and with the level of science that exists right now. And I will tell you, the worst thing that ever happened to socialism and communism was this idea that we want to impoverish you and that will be a progressive thing. Oh, everybody, it's gonna be great. I'm gonna like lower living standards, and you're gonna, that guy in the dreadlocks and the hemp shirt, you know, go follow him. He's got all the right ideas, and he's gonna take away your, you know, the things that you like and your conveniences and so on, because it's bad for your soul. Yeah, people are like, I don't think so. And also, I think it's wrong to say that working people are, not that any you said this, the commenter said this, but just as an aside, many people will argue that working class people are not on the side of environmental issues. They are, but not at the expense of jobs. That unions have been putting forward, especially like the aviation industry and so on, has been putting forward all sorts of ideas for different forms of green growth, as against these people who argue that we should just kind of, you know, these extremes, people who argue these extremes where we should just stop, you know, long distance air travel and so on, just like stop it. And like, that's throwing that entire industry under the bus, you know, and all the people that work in it under the bus. Of course, you're going to, you know, that's at the expense of human beings. So there are different ways that we can, by working together and figuring things out, there are different ways that we can sort out ecologically viable ways, sustainable ways, progressive ways, in the sense of technologically progressive ways that we can live together on the planet and consume. Everyone can consume more than they do now. It is possible.
Right. I mean, one of the presumptions of Marxism or of socialism, or even just of modern Enlightenment liberal thought, is that the world is not just a given and it is not static, but rather we create our own conditions by working upon the world and working together. We alter our own reality and our own starting conditions. So, an example would be that before certain innovations in agriculture, there was just a limit on how much people could eat and how many calories would be available to sustain a population. After major innovations in agriculture, the amount of food that is available is, now at a scale for the moment where no one need go hungry. And the rate of population growth is sustainable. And in fact, in most of the developed world, the concern is not about population growth, but about population decline. The fact that we are irrational in the way that we approach production, and that we don't aim at to actually achieve and meet human needs or to create new needs for human beings, but rather serve this abstraction about just expanding how much work is being done and exploiting labor for an abstract surplus value, has detrimental effects on the environment. And and I'm not saying that under socialism there wouldn't be mistakes and that we wouldn't do damage that we didn't want to do, and that there would be no pollution. But I'm saying that those kinds of difficulties would be much more manageable if we had more. We're taking more self-responsibility for the way in which we mediate our productive relations, and had more self-conscious control over the direction of history, where we would know that we were contributing to to producing our own conditions, rather than continually returning to this idea that what is now is what has always been, and this is this is a state of nature, and we have to always operate within the current limits, which is an ideology that serves what? It serves the established powers in society today to pretend as if they've always been in power, and the world has always operated this way, and the possibility for fundamental change is foreclosed. And
exactly, this is the way that it's, and this is what Thomas Malthus tried to argue against the Marquis de Condorcet at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. He was, Condorcet was like, look, these problems that we have, we're going to get over them. It's just, these are just technological problems. I know I give this example all the time. I'm going to move on to a different example, but, and Malthus was like, no, it's just, this is it. This is just the way that it is. Resources increase like this, and population increases like this, and these two lines will just cancel each other out. People will just have, they're going to eat too much, they're going to have too much sex, they have too many babies, and then there's not enough to eat, and then they all just die. And that's the way it is forever and ever. There's no point, you silly liberal, thinking that anything can ever change. But remember too, the quotation that I gave. Oh, and I was going to say, it's also great for capitalists, because they want you to live within certain limits. As workers, we must accept certain limitations. We demand too much. How dare we? Don't you see money doesn't make you happy? Don't you see that I'm stretched too thin here? I can't give you any more, you stupid workers. You're so greedy, and so on. They want you to be ascetic. They want the workers of other countries to be profligate. Ideally, that would be how it works. You get some stupid people in another nation to consume the wares, whereas your nation is strong and ascetic, and doesn't consume too much. And now, if you remember, I keep wanting to segue to this quote, but I wanted to say one more thing. Capitalists don't like the race to the bottom of prices either. They would love it if there was some limit placed on the amount of whatever that you could consume, and the price remained artificially high, and they had a monopoly over it or something like that. I remember years ago, the CEO or the head of Tesco, which is a supermarket chain in the United Kingdom, was saying, this was years ago, the era of cheap food is over. You people, you've had this for a long time, and it's really bad for you. And you shouldn't have all this cheap food. And you could see that he was really annoyed with how competition between all the supermarkets had led to such low prices. And of course, he didn't want that. They hate that. They hate competition. They want to be extracted. They want to extract themselves from it as much as possible. They want to buy up their competitors, monopolize, and so on. So the idea that you could put limits on people's consumption is great for capitalism. Now the quote that I'm trying to segue to, if you remember last week in our game, Marx, fascist or CEO, might have been in the Patreon edition. I think
it was the
one that I
Patreon
clicked.
part.
It
Yeah,
was the
yeah.
one that
I
clicked at
used
the
it,
end.
by the way, in the most recent video, which was another video responding to Second Thought on disinformation. I pulled this quote that you tricked me with and put it into my video. So it's,
Well, maybe you
be,
remember it better than I do. But Marx begins by saying, like, oh, well, the capitalist wants you to be an ascetic, but then you can't help but, on the other hand, because you're not just a worker for him, but on the other hand, you, not his workers, but other people, or maybe the workers, are also consumers. So he has to kind of like beguile you with new wares. And you go, oh, maybe Marx is an anti-consumerist. But he continues and he says, and it is this that is the civilizing influence of capitalism.
Right. I've got the quote right here in front of me, I think. Each capitalist does demand that his workers should save, but only his own, because they stand towards him as workers, but by no means the remaining world of workers, for these stand towards him as consumers. In spite of all pious speeches, he therefore searches for means to spur them on to consumption, to give his wares new charms, to inspire them with new needs by constant chatter. It is precisely this side of the relation of capital and labor which is an essential civilizing moment, and on which the historic justification, but also the contemporary power of capital rests. That's what he actually wrote, or roughly in translation.
Yeah, and he goes on in that source to say that so long as our needs go beyond our basic needs, then we understand that wealth has actually increased. And so these awful basic needs socialists who want to like reduce humankind to like their bare existence are very un-Marxist, because what is a basic need? Whatever civilization has to offer. At the beginning of the Grundrisse, he spends a huge amount of time explaining that needs are social. He also explains this in Wage, Labor, and Capital, that you should never be happy with the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table, although I'm mixing that with Oscar Wilde's Soul of Man Under Socialism. But it's the same idea that's being put forward, that the capitalist will tell the workers, oh, look, you know, it's fine because, look, things are getting a little bit better for you. But things are getting much, much better for him. And you should want that. You should want that too. And the example that I always give from Wage, Labor, and Capital is Marx talks about this castle. He says, like, a house may satisfy all requirements for a residence, but let there rise next to the house a castle, and the little house shrinks to a hut. And people are like, oh, see, Marx is talking about how we shouldn't envy the ruling class. No, he was saying that the castle represents what human beings are capable of, the level of civilization, and you built it. It's yours. Go and take it. That's the point. And the thing about the good thing about capitalism that people rail against is its productive side and the possibility that it gives us. And they think that's what capitalism is. And so then they think, oh, well, I should then negate that, and that would be anti-capitalist. And so they're like, oh, I'll champion like destructiveness or something, or degrowth, because they think capitalism is growth, forgetting briefly perhaps that capitalism has these difficulties growing. And that's when its historic justification is over. That's when Marx says history tells capitalism to be gone, when it stops producing wealth and it starts destroying it. We are long past that time now. It is struggling so hard, and it's telling us, hold back. You don't want more, because it can't give it to us anymore. Therefore, it has lived out its historic justification. It's given humanity what it needs. Now we can move on, and it can be gone.
Mm-hmm. I want to run this comment by one more. Oh, I lost you. Yeah, see, that's what happens when you go so far away from what is accepted, good think. You just get your devices disconnected, and that's what happened to Ashley here. But I've got a comment that says, but if we all want to have 4K TVs and cars and smartphones and so on, sorry, that is not sustainable with 8 billion people. It's not sustainable right now with 300 million Americans. And I would just point out that you're talking about an industry, particularly the TVs and smartphones, but even cars, that has planned obsolescence built in to the production process, where the aim is not to make sure every person on the planet can have access to these wonders, and they are wonders. Let's not kid ourselves. A smartphone is a terrific piece of equipment that gives us a lot of power. Same with the TV, and less so, but also same with the car. But the aim of production is not to give every person access to these powerful tools of communication and travel, but rather to sell and resell these goods to a relatively stable set of consumers who okay, I was just going on and on about.
I heard everything.
Okay. A relatively stable set of consumers who are made to want the very next version of the same thing. And we should be asking, why is it that I can't buy a computer that I can update, as new technologies come along? Why aren't we getting technology that's backwards compatible? Why do I need to get a new smartphone altogether rather than alter the one I already have? Why aren't things built to last? And why is it that this piece of equipment that is really absolutely essential to participating in the current world society, why is it so out of reach for so many people? And why is there such gradation in quality between different versions? And we're not producing things to meet people's needs, and then turn around and say the problem is too many people want things and there are too many people who have needs, is backwards. We have to change the way we produce the world in order to meet people's needs more efficiently, and also to open up new vistas of need, new things to want, that could be produced in a way that made more sense and that would last, and that wouldn't be so destructive. We should take into account, when we look for energy sources, what the environmental impact is going to be of retrieving that energy. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to expand our reach. It just means we need to do so in a way that will make sense for our future, a future we start to believe in. So
yeah, I think this kind of thinking betrays a deep neo-Malthusian undercurrent to our culture, in which we imagine that it's just like this forever and ever and ever. The way things are right now is just the way things always will be, which is really a kind of mainstream economics take on things, where it's just like this, that everything's always been this way. We've always had capitalism. I know people aren't saying this, but it's this idea that it's, nothing ever changes in any kind of important way. We will just, the population grows and technology stays the same. I mean, that's why Malthus was wrong, because all those extra minds and hands weren't just eating, they were also thinking. And when problems came up, people tried to solve them, and they did. And then people will accuse me of saying, oh, well, you can't just say, oh, well, we'll figure that out and blah, blah, blah. Well, we are figuring that out. And when we are able, and the purpose of socialism is to allow us to figure those things out in a direct way, to be able to work on these problems directly. We do have technological solutions to a lot of ecological problems, but we cannot implement them, or we're not implementing them very quickly because they don't make sense in terms of profit at the moment. And the whole point is to be able to move beyond that. And the good thing about the Second Thought video is that while using a lot of this language that's very powerful to maybe young people and so on, he does talk about the idea that if we were able to work on the world directly, that's the goal, that would be a good thing for humanity. But when you actually read Marx, I don't think people can understand, without having read him, just how radical he was, just how incredibly radical he was, because and counterintuitive, especially for his time. First, in seeing the working class as the way forward, no one at that time saw the working class as the way forward. They saw the working class, as Lenin put it, as an ulcer, and were horrified the more it grew. And when they looked at the Chartists, they saw working people, just regular people, living in the world, coming up against this issue and finding a solution. And that was, the Chartist demands. And they put through everything behind them. When they saw, overcoming of the slave trade in the United States, they saw the working and middle classes, solving that problem, and they threw everything behind them. If you we're looking at the Grundrisse and our Patreon reading group on the 20th. If you read that, it is such an incredibly radical text and incredibly optimistic in Marx following the production of wealth under capitalism and how it's undermining its own basis of creation and therefore undermines its whole basis of justification. Yes, okay, capitalism, it got us to where we are now, where we can imagine a world in which there's abundance for all. It's a possibility in our minds. And we're trying to figure out, how do we do it? And people have tried famously and not been successful. But we're talking about totally fundamentally overturning the way that human beings have ordered things. And for the first time in a fully conscious manner of what we're doing. All right, we failed the first time. Let's probably going to take another attempt, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he's so optimistic. He doesn't buy into this trash. He's so unbelievably optimistic, especially for his time, and how much faith he puts in humanity. And there's pretty much nobody like that left.
Well, we're here. We'll try to carry on their tradition. I want to flash something on the screen and say one thing about what gives me hope, a kind of a myth that gives me hope. There's this interstellar object that people, astronomers spotted. This is just an artist's rendition about, I guess, 5 years ago now. And it looked
so
to be...
it's definitely not aliens.
I'm not saying it's aliens. I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's totally aliens. No, but there are totally astronomers and physicists who've looked at this, and they don't know what it is, right? But it's propelled by something other than the sun's gravity. It's not following the gravitational pull of field. So it's a propelled object. It's an interstellar object. That's all we know for sure. But one idea that a kind of whimsical physicist, I think, talked about in an interview. And I'm not saying this is what it is. I'm not saying that there's any evidence for this, but it's something that I like, which is one idea was that it was a piece of a Dyson sphere that an ancient civilization had created, and that had eventually, because they weren't around to do the maintenance on the Dyson sphere that was necessary, or because maybe they had progressed beyond the need for such artifacts, it had fallen apart and drifted through space. So this was a chunk of this great theoretical bit of technology called the Dyson sphere. And the Dyson sphere is where an alien intelligence or humanity, either one, creates a sphere of to collect energy from the sun and redirect it for our own needs. So this vision so I'm just saying that the potential that we have to create new needs, at least in our imagination, the potential is much less limited than we think in everyday life. And whether or not a Dyson sphere is ever technologically feasible, it's feasible within the imaginations of real current contemporary physicists and scientists. It's not it's not just a fantasy. It is a theory.
Well, I will say that the most recent thing I read about what was it called? Oumuamua? Can't remember. The recent thing that I read about that is that it definitely is a natural object, and they figured out the mechanism. However, there is another example as well that Phil Cunliffe uses in his book Lenin Lives, which is the planet that they saw that appears to be a star in which the light is dimming in a way that suggests not just a planet, but perhaps something that directly harnesses the power of that star for the civilization. Again, I think probably since that book was published a few years back, there's probably a better theory or some anomaly has been explained. But nonetheless, this was something that Soviet scientists had predicted and even put into their stages of civilization, that eventually we will get to a stage of civilization which will be able to directly harness the energy from the sun. And that puts a lot of limitations. And it's amazing that Soviets were just thinking about this as you say, like as a matter of course, like
Right.
we will turn the oceans to lemonade, like as a matter of course. And
I think that would be a mistake because not everyone likes lemonade. I think you need to.
We've already done it, Doug. We have turned the oceans to lemonade, and it's a pretty good thing for most of humanity when it has been throughout human history so incredibly difficult to get something like sugar, and where the vast majority of humanity still lives in a situation in which, I quote from a 2000 World Bank report, the children have forgotten the taste of sugar and meat. The ability to produce things so quickly and so easily is good for humanity.
I agree. I want to remind everyone that we're going to do a second hour in about 15 minutes. It will start up on Patreon. I hope that in the second hour we can discuss my debate with Matt Binder, as well as the ideology of second thought, and discuss how to, in a comradely way, approach socialists who you don't have the same viewpoint that we do, and who we need to maybe, we think anyway, shift over to a slightly more future-oriented, less pessimistic form of socialism.
That is capable of actually speaking to people's wants and desires that do not have to be frustrated. And the whole point of socialism and communism is to meet them. And by the way, that World Bank report that I just said, where the children said they'd forgotten the taste of sugar and meat, was about turning our attention away from economic growth. We don't need it.
Oh my God. It wasn't some, tract bemoaning the inequality in the world. It was saying, oh, sugar and meat, we don't need that. Let's all eat crickets. Is that basically what it was selling us?
No, they just ignored it. They that's what the people were telling them. And yet what happened was they had already predetermined that well-being and so on was more important than growth. So when the World Bank investigators went out and talked to people, they downplayed that, and they played up people's low expectations and the fact that they had accommodated themselves to poverty.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that too in the Parrot Room. Again, if you are thinking about joining the Patreon, this is a good time, because next week, this coming weekend, Ashley's going to be leading another workshop on the Grundrisse.
We're on Notebook 7 of the Grundrisse set. We're talking about the famous fragment on machines. Will the machines take over?
You'll get 2 hours of Spencer Leonard, one that's facing towards the public, one that's for patrons only this week. We've got a lecture coming from Ashley. I am working on yet another Critical Cuts that will be either coming out this week or next week. When you support us at Sublation, you are supporting the most optimistically contrarian group of socialists on the internet. I think that should be our new slogan. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the Parrot Room.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential